What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So today I want to talk about dystopian novels. I want to talk about 4 classics from, nearly a century ago in some cases, or over a century even. I'd have to double check the dates. But these are old classics. The newest one is from the 40s. And they approach dystopian narratives in different ways. And they have different sort of political commentary, philosophical commentary, and as books, I think they differ in how compelling they are, but all 4 of them are worth checking out. Again, all 4 of them are classics to some degree or another, and they influenced one another in some obvious and documented ways. So I'm going to get into it. I'm going to keep it very spoiler light. Like, I'm going to discuss certain aspects of the books, but I'm not going to spoil major reveals or fates of the characters or stuff like that. It's going to be, if you want to go in just totally cold, you won't get that by the end of this video. But yeah, it's going to be effectively spoiler free. But the first novel is called We, as in W-E, and it was written by a Russian author, and I have read his name. It's a mouthful, and I'm not good at pronouncing Russian names, so I'm not even going to try. But if you just look up We, W-E, the novel, you'll find his name. And it's very interesting. It influenced the ones after it in some very obvious ways, and again, in some documented ways, and some shit-talking ways, which I'll discuss. But this is sort of the OG dystopian novel. And it was written by, again, a Russian author who witnessed the Russian Revolution. He wrote this book, and according to the intro to the book, it basically got him ousted from the Soviet Union. He apparently wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin and said, look, you're not letting me publish the book. I haven't done anything bad enough to get killed, or be executed, but I'm an author, and if you won't let me publish, that you might as well just kill me. So let me leave. Let me leave the Soviet Union. And Stalin capitulated. And, there's speculation in the intro about, why Stalin chose to do that. I think it kind of sounded like the author was popular enough that it wouldn't be worth it to kill the guy, but he could just let him leave. And it was like, yeah, fine, whatever. It's kind of how it sounded. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's apparently what happened. And the intro as well, I think, accurately said that compared to follow-up dystopian novels, this one has some sort of the funner, livelier, sillier sci-fi elements. The intro compared it to Buck Rogers. And I saw that. And I saw it in comparison to stuff that came out later. So it had almost like a Planet of the Apes, like an OG, the original film Planet of the Apes sort of vibe to certain parts of the story. And I thought that was fun. I'm a big fan of old school sci-fi, a big fan of pulp science fiction. And so I appreciated that aspect of the story. Now, to give sort of a premise, this is set after some great war that happened that wiped out some huge amount of humanity. And it's this dystopian society. It has a lot of the elements you'd expect. Everything is controlled. It's very collectivist, very authoritarian. A theme in all 4 of these books is that things like sex and relationships and mating are regulated by the state, and you've got to, in some way, shape, or form, apply or be assigned a mate and a partner. And yes, they're very much against organic relationships or pleasure, with one exception. But they're against love. They're against kind of classic romance are these dystopian states. And We is no exception. And We is interesting because all of the characters have numbers instead of names. And that influenced one of the other books. But they have numbers instead of names. That does make reading it slightly annoying because you've got to keep track of who's which number rather than whose name is which. Now, it is a Russian book, so if it was names, that would have sucked too. If you've read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, that reading the Russian names is a chore, especially since they so frequently, this is a common thing in Russian literature, is they'll sometimes call the person their surname, sometimes call them their first name, sometimes call them their full name. They'll call them shorthand nicknames that to an English reader don't make sense. Not unlike how if you didn't speak English and you saw a character whose name is William be written as Billy, and it switched interchangeably between them. If you didn't speak English, that'd be weird. You'd be like, oh, Billy isn't an intuitive shorthand for William. Stuff like that is very common in Russian novels. So in that sense, the fact that they're called numbers isn't that big of a deal, honestly. But they are called numbers, and it is an interesting dystopia because ideologically it's interesting. It's a very logical and like mathematically oriented philosophy that drives this society. And basically it's all rooted in this idea that society is meant to be rational. It's meant to be understood and solved at a rational level. The author, because it's written first person, so the author is a character, or not the author, but like the narrator is a character, and he's frequently saying stuff about the past and kind of criticizing the past, and the past being us and before, but criticizing like democratic society, or criticizing the idea that like people would just like randomly mate and do stuff like that, and do it in this uncoordinated, chaotic, random kind of way rather than in a logical, prescriptive way. Like even kind of mocks elections from the distant past, saying like they didn't even know who was going to win. They didn't even know what the outcome would be. That's just chaos. It's like, and you're reading it and you're like, okay. And there's also an interesting premise in this book where starting off, they're trying to travel to other planets because their goal is basically like if they can find other civilizations, they want to spread this horrible dystopian philosophy to other planets if possible. So that's unsettling. And it's interesting because it has relationships to other real world philosophies that have kind of had similar schools of thought, like logical positivism had some of that kind of stuff going. Not as extreme, obviously, as this dystopian society, but different people have to varying degrees wanted to engage in some kind of scientism, some sort of ability or some sort of desire to use logic and science to just solve social problems and sort of do away with the chaos of individualism and democracy and so on. Like that's a real thing that real thinkers have tried to do and advocated for in various ways. So we is not fictional in that way. And of course it's a response to the Soviet Union on some level. But the book doesn't feel as much as some of the other examples here as specifically targeted like towards communism, as you might guess it would be. It does feel, again, like sort of more typical sci-fi, more imaginative sci-fi. It feels all the sillier that, a state like the Soviet Union and its leader like Stalin would be so pissed off about this book being written. But you can see why at the same time. But yeah, a very interesting book. It is sort of the godfather of dystopian novels. And I recommend it. It's not my favorite of these four. It's probably my third favorite, if I had to be honest. But it's definitely worth a read. All four of these are worth a read. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to rank them but it, and this one is not near the top, but it's still definitely worth checking out and was fun. And I'm glad I read it. Moving on, we've got Huxley's Brave New World. And I'm going to do these in chronological order of in which they came out. But Huxley's Brave New World, very interesting book. In this case, it's a hypothetical society where it's very restrictive on freedom. People are very, very, very are controlled in a very, very coordinated way. That's genetic manipulation of, what the hell is the word? Fetuses, essentially. But yeah, pre-born humans are genetically manipulated. And ordinary reproduction is not allowed, meaning sex is allowed. In fact, sex is encouraged. But ordinary birth, impregnating someone through sex is a no-no. It's all done in the lab. And they're controlled. They'll do it where there'll be different types of people. It's a caste system. There's alphas all the way to, not deltas, but whatever the E is. But there's like a 5-stage caste system, and they have different responsibilities, and they engineer them, and then they condition them as infants and onward through all sorts of means where, when you're sleeping, they'll like read phrases to you over and over again to get certain party slogans to become axiomatic and so on. But they do all this stuff to program and condition you so that you are actually you actually prefer your station in life. So you might be some lower tier in the caste system person who is a laborer, rather than an authority figure, but you prefer it that way. You're programmed to prefer that kind of work and to be kind of off-put by the idea. If you're a delta, they program you to be off-put by the idea of being an alpha, And what's interesting about this society is it's deeply hedonistic. You're just constantly encouraged to feel pleasure. It's very sexual. There's orgies constantly and stuff like that, but no real relationships. And what they don't want you to feel is very intense emotions like love and tragedy and stuff like that. Extreme positive and negative emotions that you become very invested in. They don't want you to feel. And it's this interesting society because between all that programming and all of the hedonistic pleasure and this drug they use called Soma, which, the influence is obvious already if you've played the video game Soma, which is a great game and I highly recommend, where you think they got the name from. But in any case, there's this drug called Soma that everyone uses. That's, this drug designed to keep you happy and satisfied. They use all these means to keep social harmony. And what I think is interesting about Brave New World is that right up front, that premise, if you're being honest, whilst it's obvious what's bad about this, whilst it's obvious what the loss of art and love and that kind of stuff brings, and while it's obvious, that this is not freedom, that this is undemocratic and so on, whilst it's sort of obvious and not really a spoiler hardly, but it's obvious that certain characters in the book kind of get wise to the fact that hey, this is sort of robbing life of its meaning. Whilst those things are obvious to us as readers, you do actually have to seriously contend with the benefits. You have to seriously contend with the fact that this is a society where people are happy, they are satisfied. War and suffering and tragedy and illness and so on just aren't fucking happening to them. It kind of forces you to ask, is it totally a given that our present world is better than this? Would it not be preferable actually to live in this thing? I think if you're an honest reader, you ask that question. I think it's sort of lacking self-awareness and honesty to just read it and only view it as terrible, only view it as oh, this is some ugly dystopian hell, terrible. Unlike another book, which I'll get into. But I think that's the most interesting aspect of Brave New World. And not unlike it has some connection to real world thinking. This feels in some ways a response to some of the early 20th century intellectuals and progressive thinkers and whatnot. It seems like somewhat of a response to people like B.F. Skinner or people like H.G. Wells, who were a little too confident in our ability to do social engineering, I think. So, whilst it's a fictional utopia, it does feel relevant to real world politics and real world political philosophy. And I've had conversations with people, not to get too off in the weeds about philosophy, but I have a philosophy degree. And I had a conversation in one of my classes where the people were basically saying this, hey, as these social sciences evolve and become more capable, as they become more akin to the natural sciences like chemistry and physics, we'll be able to design society much better. And we can make a sort of perfect society. And, and as the conversation went on, it got more creepily controlling and anti-democratic, from my professor and from my fellow students. And this was a capstone course. So there was only 6 of us in the room and we all kind of knew each other. So we could kind of be more blunt with our opinions. And they kind of tip their hats to being a little too okay with social engineering, in my view. And I challenged that. And I said to them, look, A, that sounds terrible. But B, that's never going to happen because the social sciences will never be that capable. That is a myth. That is a fantasy. And they argued with me. Then they had their rationale and said oh, but the social sciences are younger. They've had less time to work. And I said, well, computer science is younger than the social sciences, and it's made light years of progress. Whereas the social sciences are barely better off than they were in the beginning. And that's because the social sciences deal with topics that resist scientific investigation, like abstract metaphysical concepts about identity and phenomenological concepts about consciousness and experience. There's that. It's insanely complicated, and you can't do experiments that you would need to do without violating profound ethical rules about like experimenting on humans and about other higher functioning animals. So the idea that the social sciences will ever have the rigor of the core hard sciences is silly. And science is well purposed for studying things like billiard balls. It's not well purposed for studying things like human behavior. Okay, it's not that it utterly resists scientific investigation, but there are limits. And trying to take that further and trying to be like, we can actually design society and make it perfect because we can just approach human beings the way scientists approach billiard balls, that's dangerous. And something like Brave New World is showing you how dangerous that is. And even Brave New World is ambitious about how effective this could be, I think. But you see that to make it effective, they have to do fucked up shit and really be controlling. But again, circling back, if you're honest, though, in the opposite direction, this book does force you to ask, is it definitely true that this is worse than the real world? Because the real world has a lot of problems. And a lot of problems that this fictional dystopia does not have. And you have to take that seriously, I think. So that to me is the biggest selling point of Brave New World. Moving on. We have a novella called Anthem, written by Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher, famous for her book Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which I've actually not read either of those. I do want to read Atlas Shrugged, but I did read The Virtue of Selfishness, which is just a philosophy book that she wrote. It's not a fictional book. And I've read this novella of hers, Anthem, and it is a dystopian novel. It's similar to We in a lot of ways. I mean, it even borrows from We in that We, again, like the characters had numbers for names, and the same is true in Anthem. Anthem leans more into the critique of like communism and collectivism, because if I recall correctly, Ayn Rand, I don't know if she grew up in the Soviet Union at any point, but I know that her father did, and he then emigrated. But a lot of her ideology was driven by this reaction to the Soviet Union as a society and Marxism and Leninism as philosophies. But in any case, that's pretty obvious when you read Anthem. And one way in which it's obvious is that the characters actually don't have individual pronouns. So they don't say I, they only say we. They only speak collectively. They say we and our, not I or me or mine. And, again, spoiler alert, the character, the main character, has his mind opened a bit about that as the novel goes on. But again, just like the other two, very oppressive society, a reoccurring theme of controlled sexual relations, controlled romantic relations, because he becomes smitten with a character, but it's not the character that's assigned to him, so that becomes a problem. And yeah, it's interesting. It's shorter. Again, it's a novella, but it's interesting. It's good. I said I would rank these. I would say this is my fourth favorite of the four. I think I like We more than it, and I like Brave New World more than it. So I'm not going to talk as much about it, but that one is worth checking out. And it's interesting because some of these novels are from more progressive or left-wing authors, and this one is explicitly from a right-wing, egoist, libertarian, objectivist author. But nevertheless, there's reoccurring things because they're all pushing back against authoritarianism. And that authoritarianism can be sort of pan-ideological or pan left-wing, right-wing spectrum, or it can be more clearly left-wing authoritarianism, and this book is more explicitly responding to left-wing authoritarianism. But despite that, since they're all responding to authoritarianism, the critiques are similar. And whether you're left-wing or right-wing, I think you should read Ayn Rand, I think you should read Anthem, but it is my least favorite of the four. So, going so far, Anthem my least favorite, We my second least, and Brave New World is my second favorite. Brave New World is number 2, and the number 1 spot is for the next book. My favorite of the 4 is 1984 by George Orwell. Now, I read this one very recently because I've read a lot of Orwell, but I've exclusively read his nonfiction. I've exclusively read his political essays, and I finally was like, all right, I like Orwell. I've actually read quite a bit of Orwell. I should actually read the thing he's most known for, 1984, and check it out. I loved 1984. It is my favorite of the 4 books. It is the newest of the 4. It is very obviously influenced by Brave New World and We. And that's no secret. And Orwell himself kind of drew attention to the fact that Huxley was influenced by We. And he, from what I read, it sounds like that was sort of like a criticism on some level, or more like a criticism in that he hadn't owned up to being as influenced by it as he obviously was, or I don't fully know what happened, but that's kind of what I read. And in reverse, Huxley was critical of, critical might be a harsh word, but Huxley was offered a counter argument to Orwell. Apparently he wrote him a letter basically saying, hey, I think the dystopian future would look more like my book, where the state has to sort of coax you into being okay and appreciating the dystopian world rather than just harshly imposing it on you, which is what happens in 1984. And that debate is interesting. And I think there's a lot of merit in Huxley's argument, and that kind of concept goes all the way back to, the bread and circuses narrative of ancient Rome and stuff like that. And plenty of that tracks to our current world. But nevertheless, 1984 is very fascinating because despite being so overtly authoritarian, despite being so harsh, so bleak, despite the fact that unlike Brave New World and unlike We, the characters clearly don't like living in this world, despite the fact that it seems maybe uninteresting for that reason, where it's well, yeah, this is terrible. It's obviously terrible. Why would anyone support this system unless it was just utterly imposed on them? There's what's insightful about this? Yeah, harsh tyranny is harsh tyranny. Wow, you really blew my mind, George. That might be the reflexive response to hearing the premise or getting into the book initially. But to me, this is the most interesting of the 4 because I think George Orwell is the most insightful political thinker of the 4. So the general ways in which he depicts how propaganda works and how people's minds and attitudes are altered by being in harsh places like this, and the way he explores the different little ways that the Big Brother party forces capitulation, that it forces assimilation, is very insightful and interesting. And I'm not going to spoil what it is, but when it's eventually revealed how this happened and what the driving philosophy of Big Brother is, it's very interesting. I think philosophically, it's very interesting. Very harsh, very bleak, but very interesting. And I like the influence it's had. The Big Brother 1984 sort of aesthetic has clearly influenced a lot of stuff that's come after, including in video games. You see the influence in Half-Life or in Killzone and stuff like that. Aesthetically, it's a compelling, harsh, bleak thing, and I like that. And yeah, of the 4 books, I think it's dramatically the most intense. I think it's politically the most interesting. And all of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. Again, Brave New World forces you to actually ask, well, do we know that our society is better than this? 1984 does not force you to think that or to question that. Very clearly, you don't want to live in 1984. It's very clearly bad. But with that said, I do think that 1984 is politically and philosophically the most intriguing of the 4. And I can't unpack a lot of why without spoiling stuff about Big Brother and the party. So I'm just going to encourage you to go read it. But that is my take overall. So yeah, in summary, we've got these 4 dystopian classics in order. We, by a Russian guy whose name I can never remember or pronounce. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Anthem, a novella by Ayn Rand. And 1984 by George Orwell. They clearly influenced one another. Again, We influencing both Brave New World and 1984, Orwell kind of throwing shade at Huxley for not owning up to that more, is I believe how it went. We clearly influencing Anthem, where Anthem literally borrows the convention of having the characters be named numbers rather than ordinary names. And then, Brave New World having plenty of influences up to it, including like the video game Soma taking its title from the drug used in that book. All of them kind of then influencing, well, I don't know how much Anthem influenced Orwell, but certainly we and Brave New World influenced 1984. 1984 has gone on to influence all kinds of stuff, including other video games like Half-Life and Killzone. That's all very cool, and if you're a nerd and you're into sci-fi shit, and if you're at all into politics and social issues, all these books are worth reading. And again, it's cool to see how they're written by people from different points of views. They're in some different ways written in response to different ideologies, but they all are responses to authoritarianism. And despite the authors themselves coming from very different political orientations, they sort of overlap in a Venn diagram in terms of what their critiques of authoritarianism are. So that's all very fascinating, all compelling and worth a read. So I would go check out all 4 of them if you haven't. And that's all I got today. Subscribe if you haven't, like if you haven't, comment if you have any thoughts or have any other dystopian books, especially classics, from the early 20th century or even prior that you would recommend. And the channel is already starting to pick up a little. I'm seeing some subscribers from my MMA channel coming over. If this is my first video you've seen, I do have an MMA channel. It is called Michael Walsh MMA. It's starting to pick up. I was inspired by that channel's rising success to make the second channel, which is dedicated towards nerd topics, sci-fi, comic books, video games, film, anime, etc. So if you're into that kind of stuff, stick around. If you're into MMA, go check out my MMA channel, Michael Walsh MMA, and take care.